Jonathan Blake here. Tonight's story isn't just about jets in the sky or ships on the water. It's about a single speck of land that, if seized, could choke an entire nation's economy, reshape the balance of power in the Persian Gulf, and drag the world into a terrifying new phase of conflict. Before we begin, if you enjoy clear, no-fluff narration that breaks down high-stakes geopolitical moments into an easy-to-follow story, consider subscribing to Jonathan Blake. And if you've got a strong opinion while you're listening, drop it in the comments. Your engagement genuinely helps this channel reach more people. The air war is about to escalate into something far more dangerous. New reports indicate the United States is preparing for the unthinkable. Boots on the ground, not a full-scale invasion, not a years-long occupation plan, but a fast, decisive operation aimed at a target that Iran has treated like a guarded vault for decades. According to reporting, the Pentagon is rushing a large amphibious assault force toward the Iranian coastline. Thousands of combat-ready Marines paired with an amphibious fleet designed for rapid sea-based action. The destination isn't a random outpost. It's the regime's crown jewel, a heavily defended island that plays an outsized role in Iran's financial survival. And here's the detail that makes this moment feel different from every tense standoff that came before. For decades, U.S. presidents circled this target and backed away. In 1979, President Carter considered striking the island, but ultimately didn't. Then in 1988, President Reagan weighed the same idea, and again, the United States stopped short. But now, the pattern appears to have broken, because in the last 24 hours, the reporting suggests the United States authorized the movement of an amphibious ready group and a Marine expeditionary unit into the Middle East. Now let's translate that into plain language. An amphibious ready group is built for speed and flexibility. It's a floating toolkit. Ships, aircraft, Marines, sailors, and the logistics that allow them to hit a shoreline, seize a critical objective, conduct special operations, evacuate civilians, or rapidly shift from one mission to the next. We're talking roughly 5,000 personnel, about half Marines, half sailors, trained to deploy fast, fight hard, and hold ground long enough for follow-on forces to arrive, or long enough to complete the mission and disappear back over the horizon. 5,000 troops is not an invasion force for a country as large as Iran, but for a single island, especially an island whose value is measured not just in terrain, but in the money it moves. 5,000 can be the difference between a regime breathing and a regime suffocating. So let's talk about the island itself and why it matters. Here's the blunt statistic. Around 90% of Iran's exported crude oil moves through this island. 90%. Not because the oil is pulled out of the ground there. This matters, and we'll clarify it, but because the island serves as a terminal, a massive loading hub, a place where enormous tankers can come in, fill up, and then push down the Persian Gulf toward the Strait of Hormuz and beyond. And beyond that choke point, the oil flows to the primary customer, China. In other words, the island isn't just infrastructure. It's leverage. It's the point where pipelines and profits converge, where barrels become cash, where the regime's survival, political and military, gets financed. Because those oil profits aren't just paying for schools or roads. They're feeding the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, often described as the regime's shield and sword. The IRGC isn't simply a military organization. It's an economic empire with a security force attached. And when the state gives that organization deep control over oil revenue, the island becomes more than a terminal. It becomes the IRGC's lifeline. Now, remember the key clarification. The oil is largely produced on the Iranian mainland. It moves through pipelines to storage depots on the island, and from there, it's loaded onto tankers that carry it to the world. So if you hold the island, you don't have to destroy every oil field. You don't have to bomb every refinery. You can simply choke the exit. And if you choke the exit, you starve the regime of cash. And if you starve the regime of cash, you don't just weaken Iran's economy. You weaken the machinery that funds its proxies, its missile programs, its regional influence operations, and the internal security systems that keep dissent crushed. That is why this island has been a target in American strategic thinking for decades. But there's a reason no president pulled the trigger, because going after it is not a normal strike. It's a statement. It's a move that says, we're not just punishing you, we're threatening the engine that keeps you alive. And when you threaten that engine, you invite retaliation not in one place, but across the entire region. Now, the story takes a sharp turn because the United States has reportedly already begun shaping the battlefield. A statement attributed to President Trump described a bombing raid, one of the most powerful in the region's history, aimed at military targets on the island. The description emphasizes that missile sites, mining operations, and military installations were hit. But the same message suggests something else. Oil infrastructure was not targeted, at least not yet. That "not yet" matters, because it sets up a pressure point. The message reportedly included a warning that if Iran interferes with free passage through the Strait of Hormuz, the decision to avoid oil infrastructure could be reconsidered. So read that slowly. It's not just "stop or we'll hit you." It's "stop or we'll hit the thing that pays for your survival." And when that line gets drawn, every move in the next days becomes a test. Iran tests it. The United States responds. And then, if nobody blinks, a strike becomes a landing. Which brings us back to the Marines. After the strikes were announced, the president was asked about the idea of taking the island. The answer was not a direct yes, and it wasn't a clean no either. It was the kind of response that keeps every option alive, because in modern conflict, uncertainty is a weapon. Say no, and you reassure your enemy. Say yes, and you give them a calendar. So instead, the response left the world hanging, and that is exactly where danger grows, because history has a pattern. When military assets move into a region, especially specialized assets built for a specific mission, those assets often get used, not always, but often enough that planners, allies, and adversaries take the movement as a signal. Now, it's important to be honest about what we do and do not know. An amphibious ready group can be used for many missions. It could be positioned to secure shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz. It could support special operations. It could be a rapid reaction force if the conflict expands. It could be there to evacuate civilians if regional capitals come under attack. Or yes, its most dramatic option, it could be preparing to seize an objective like this island. And that uncertainty is the point. Because the island is the kind of target you don't need to hold forever. You only need to hold it long enough to force a decision. You seize it, you demonstrate control over the export terminal. You prove that Iran's lifeline can be cut, and suddenly every negotiation shifts. Now let me ask you the first engagement question, and I want you to answer it in the comments with your best reasoning, not just a yes or no. Do you believe a limited seizure of a strategic island would actually deter Iran, or would it guarantee a wider regional war? Hold that thought. Because Iran's response, at least in public messaging, is exactly what many expected. Iran's armed forces have signaled that if U.S. strikes expand to Iranian oil infrastructure, then Iran would retaliate against energy infrastructure across the region, particularly in Gulf states. But here's the brutal twist. The kinds of attacks they threaten are the kinds of actions they've already been accused of pursuing. Refineries, oil depots, energy nodes, targets designed not just to hurt a rival, but to raise the cost of conflict for every neighbor, every partner, and every economy that depends on stable energy flow. And when those attacks spread, when they hit even countries that are trying to stay out of the fight, the justification starts to collapse. Because it stops looking like defense, it starts looking like coercion. At the same time, the narrative coming out of U.S. officials suggests a different trend. Fewer missile launches, fewer drone attacks, an implication that Iran's ability to sustain the tempo may be weakening. If that assessment is true, it changes the risk calculation. A weakened opponent is still dangerous, but a weakened opponent may also be more likely to lash out unpredictably. And that's when miscalculation becomes catastrophic. Now let's talk timing, because timing tells you what a government thinks it can get away with. The amphibious ships reportedly involved include the USS Tripoli, normally based in Japan. A transit from Japan to the Middle East typically takes around 10 to 14 days, depending on routing, speed, and operational requirements. And that matters because the U.S. president previously suggested the operations timeline could be 4 to 5 weeks, before later walking back the certainty of any schedule. When leaders stop naming timelines, it usually means one of two things. Either the operation is going worse than expected, or it's going better than expected, and they don't want to lock themselves into a promise. And when you combine that with the movement of amphibious forces, it suggests the planners are preparing for a second phase, one that may require physical presence, not just standoff strikes. Now, another key development is a press conference by senior U.S. defense officials. Their messaging painted Iran's leadership as disorganized, hiding, and struggling to communicate, suggesting that the internal chain of command may be under severe strain, and they claim the new leadership figure is wounded and avoiding audio or video appearances, relying instead on written statements. That detail, written statements only, was framed as a sign of fear and instability. Whether you accept that framing or not, the purpose of the message is clear. It's psychological. It tells Iran's elites, you are exposed. It tells Iran's public, your leaders are not in control. And it tells U.S. allies, the regime is cracking. Then came another claim, that U.S. forces made military history by using precision strike missiles in combat in a way not previously seen, including strikes against naval targets. In plain terms, the U.S. is projecting the image of overwhelming technical reach, deep strikes, maritime interdiction, and the ability to hit valuable assets quickly. And that image matters because it sets the stage for the ultimate threat. Not just we can hit you, but we can isolate you. And isolation in this case means cutting the cash flow. Now we arrive at what may be the true center of gravity in this whole storyline, Iran's nuclear stockpile. For years, one of the most explosive points in negotiations has been enriched uranium, because when a country enriches uranium to high levels, levels that have limited civilian justification, other nations begin asking a blunt question. If this isn't for a weapon, then what is it for? Reports and public statements have suggested that Iran wanted to keep a significant portion of its enriched material while maintaining core nuclear capabilities. Critics argue that this creates a permanent threshold posture, a situation where a nation can move toward a weapon on short notice, using the stockpile as leverage in future negotiations. Supporters of diplomacy argue the opposite, that inspections and agreements can cap escalation. But in the scenario we're narrating tonight, officials framed the nuclear issue as central, saying the mission's core objective is to deny Iran a nuclear weapon. A journalist asked a pointed question about whether any mission can truly succeed without physically taking control of the uranium stockpile. And the answer was careful. It emphasized that the United States has options across the spectrum, without publicly stating which option would be used. That kind of answer is not meant to satisfy the public. It's meant to keep adversaries guessing. Now step back and look at the full board. You have airstrikes targeting military sites. You have a warning that oil infrastructure could be hit. You have an amphibious force moving into reach. You have psychological messaging about leadership instability. And you have the nuclear question hanging over all of it. This is not a single event. It's a build, a tightening, a pressure campaign that may be preparing for a physical seizure of leverage. And the leverage is not just land. It's money. It's oil. It's the ability to fund war. So here's the second question I promised you, and again, answer it in the comments because I read them and I use your perspectives to shape future narrations. If you were advising Iran's leadership right now, would you prioritize keeping the Strait of Hormuz open to avoid provoking strikes on oil infrastructure? Or would you gamble on disruption, believing it forces the world to pressure the United States to back down? Because that is the trap. Keep it open, and you look weak to your hardliners. Close it, and you may trigger the very escalation you fear. And while that dilemma plays out, the Marines keep moving. Now, I also want to address the energy and the misinformation battlefield that always comes with high-stakes conflict. Online, narratives multiply faster than facts. Claims spread, quotes get twisted, and coordinated campaigns try to drown out measured analysis. So if you appreciate calm, structured narration, no yelling, no panic, subscribe to Jonathan Blake. It tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters. And if you're already subscribed, leave a quick comment with where you're listening from. Even a short message helps this channel grow. Now let's talk about what a seizure of the island would actually look like, because the word take sounds simple until you imagine the details. First, U.S. forces would need to suppress coastal defenses, missile batteries, radar sites, anti-ship capabilities, anything that could turn an approach into a slaughter. Second, they would need to secure the terminal area and the storage depots, not necessarily to destroy them, but to control them. Third, they would need to protect the island from counterattack. Drones, fast boats, missiles, mines, and potentially airborne raids. And fourth, they would need to message the world in real time, because the moment the island is seized, the global market hears one thing: supply risk. Insurance rates jump, shipping becomes more expensive, countries dependent on Gulf energy demand clarity, and Iran's partners, especially the buyers, start calculating how long the disruption might last. In that moment, the island becomes not just a military objective. It becomes a global economic lever, which is why, in this scenario, the United States might consider the most dangerous strategy of all: taking the island, holding it briefly, and using it to force concessions, then withdrawing before getting bogged down. That sounds clean, but war is rarely clean, because Iran would have its own options: mining shipping lanes, striking at Gulf energy facilities, launching proxy attacks, targeting U.S. bases, or trying to turn the seizure into a propaganda victory, painting it as theft, imperialism, and proof that negotiation is pointless. So the central question becomes whether the island is worth the cascade. And that's why previous presidents hesitated, because once you treat a nation's economic lifeline as a target, you are no longer playing for points. You're playing for survival. And when a regime believes it's fighting for survival, it may choose extreme measures. Now, there's another layer that doesn't get enough attention. Even if the United States never lands a single Marine, the mere movement of an amphibious force can force Iran to reposition. It has to defend coastlines. It has to spread assets. It has to anticipate raids. And every unit that defends an island is a unit that isn't defending something else. In strategy, sometimes you don't need to attack. Sometimes you just need to make your opponent believe you might. But here's the problem. When you push that bluff too far, you can trigger the exact event you were trying to avoid. A nervous commander fires, a ship gets hit, a missile lands where it wasn't supposed to, and suddenly leaders have to respond. Not because it's wise, but because politically they feel they have no choice. That's how escalations happen. Not always from grand plans, sometimes from a single moment where nobody wanted to be the one to blink. So where does that leave us tonight? It leaves us with a conflict that is no longer confined to the air. It leaves us with the possibility, still unconfirmed, still uncertain, of a sea-based operation aimed at the heart of Iran's oil export system. And it leaves us with a ticking clock measured not just in days, but in transit time. Because if an amphibious group is moving, it will arrive. And once it arrives, every actor in the region will have to decide what they believe the United States is prepared to do. Whether this becomes a raid, a seizure, a show of force, or a prelude to something larger, one truth stands above the rest. When oil, nuclear risk, and prestige collide in a narrow waterway, the margin for error is razor thin. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of listener I built this channel for. Subscribe to Jonathan Blake for more narrated breakdowns, and tell me in the comments your answer to those two questions. Because the smartest room isn't a studio. It's the one we build together, one comment at a time.